The vast darkness of space echoed with the remnants of endless battles. For centuries, two alien civilizations had waged a war that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The Valaran Confederacy and the Krell Imperium danced their deadly dance across countless star systems, leaving behind trails of destroyed planets and broken dreams. Hyun Park stood on the observation deck of the research station, her dark eyes scanning the holographic map that flickered with countless points of conflict. Red and blue markers represented centuries of battle, a complex web of destruction that seemed impossible to untangle. Her fingers traced the lines of ongoing conflicts, each representing millions of lives lost in a war that had long forgotten its original purpose. The station hummed with quiet tension. Research teams worked silently, analyzing data streams that told stories of devastation. Massive starships moved like chess pieces across the galactic board, their weapons primed, their crews weary from generations of continuous warfare. Jae Kwon approached Hyun, his datapad displaying the latest casualty reports. "Another frontier system has been destroyed," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of endless destruction. The conflict had its roots in a territorial dispute over resource-rich star systems near the galactic core. What started as a simple disagreement had escalated into a war that consumed entire civilizations. The Valaran Confederacy, with their crystal-based technology and hive-mind communication, fought against the Krell Imperium's biomechanical war. Machines Yoon Choi, the station's xenohistorian, walked in with a stack of ancient records. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them down. "I've found something," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the station's soft machinery. The records told a story of initial contact. Two species, once curious about each other, had slowly transformed their diplomatic misunderstandings into a total war. Star systems became battlegrounds. Entire planetary populations were reduced to memories. The war consumed resources, lives, and hope with an insatiable hunger. Hyun looked closer at the holographic map. Countless battle lines crisscrossed the galaxy like angry scars. Each line represented millions of lives lost, entire civilizations erased, planets turned to dust. The war had become more than a conflict. It was a way of existence for both species. The research station itself was a testament to the ongoing conflict. Built in a neutral zone, it housed researchers from various species who sought to understand the seemingly endless war. They were the observers, the collectors of data, the ones who tried to make sense of a conflict that had long since lost its original meaning. Jay's voice broke the silence. "We've detected something unusual in the outer sectors." His fingers danced across the holographic interface, pulling up new data streams. Strange energy signatures were emerging, patterns that didn't match either the Valaran or Krell technological signatures. Yoon leaned in, her eyes wide with curiosity. The map shifted, revealing a small, unremarkable star system that seemed to pulse with an unusual energy. It was a point of light in the vast darkness, a potential key to understanding the conflict. "Something is different," Hyun muttered, her intuition telling her that everything was about to change. The station's lights flickered momentarily. Outside, the vast expanse of space continued its silent watch. Millions of stars witnessed the ongoing conflict, indifferent to the struggles of the civilizations that fought beneath them. In that moment, none of them knew that a small, young species was about to enter the galactic stage. Humanity waited, unknowing on a blue planet that would soon become the most important point of interest in an 800,000-year-old war. The map continued to pulse. The conflict continued. And somewhere in the darkness, something was about to change. Everything. The galaxy had become a machine of war, its gears turning with mechanical precision. Daeun Kim watched the endless battle simulations, her fingers tracing the predictable patterns that had defined the conflict for countless generations. Starships moved like clockwork, their trajectories calculated and recalculated thousands of times. The Valaran Confederacy and the Krell Imperium had reached a point where war was no longer about victory, but about maintaining a delicate balance of destruction. Each engagement followed carefully mapped strategies, with both sides knowing exactly how the other would respond. Seok-yoon, a diplomatic observer, sat in the central command center of the neutral Galactic Council. His eyes were tired, reflecting the exhaustion of centuries of failed negotiations. The walls around him were covered with holographic displays showing battle zones, resource allocations, and population movements. "It's like a dance," he muttered to himself. "A dance where nobody remembers why they started dancing." The war had become so standardized that computer algorithms could predict battle outcomes with near-perfect accuracy. Entire campaigns were planned months in advance, with minimal surprise or innovation. Soldiers on both sides followed predetermined combat protocols, their actions as predictable as mathematical equations. Daeun's research team had been tracking the conflict's progression for years. They had created complex models that showed how the war had transformed from a passionate territorial dispute to a cold, calculated system of mutual destruction. Resources were consumed, planets were destroyed, yet neither side seemed capable of breaking the cycle. In the research station's central laboratory, holographic projections showed the economic impact of the continuous conflict. Entire galactic sectors had been reduced to wastelands. Billions of lives existed in a state of perpetual preparation for war, their entire civilization structured around military infrastructure. The neutral Galactic Council watched with increasing concern. Their diplomatic efforts had become nothing more than routine meetings, where representatives from both warring civilizations went through the motions of peace talks without any real intention of resolution. Seok reviewed the latest diplomatic transcripts. They read like legal documents filled with complex language that meant absolutely nothing. Each sentence was carefully crafted to say everything and nothing simultaneously. It was a language of perpetual conflict, where words were weapons more precise than any starship cannon. Daeun discovered something interesting in her latest data analysis. The war had reached a mathematical equilibrium. Both civilizations had developed technologies so advanced and so similar that their battles resulted in near-perfect statistical exchanges. A battle here would be balanced by a loss there, creating a galactic stalemate that seemed impossible to break. The research station's artificial intelligence calculated that at the current rate, the conflict could continue for another 1,000 generations without any significant change. It was a cold mathematical prediction that sent chills through the research team. Outside the station's protective shields, massive starships continued their dance of destruction. Entire planetary systems were reduced to battlefield zones, their resources stripped, their populations displaced. The war had become more than a conflict. It was a way of existence. Seok looked at the latest population charts. Fewer children were being born. Fewer resources were being developed for anything other than military purposes. Both civilizations were slowly consuming themselves, trapped in a cycle of conflict that seemed to have no escape. Daeun's team began to realize something profound. The war was no longer about winning or losing. It had become a complex system of population control, resource management, and technological development. Fighting was not the goal. The process of fighting had become the goal. As another standard battle sequence played out in the holographic displays, nobody noticed the small anomaly emerging in the data, a tiny, unexpected variable that would, soon, change everything. The galaxy continued its mechanical dance, unaware that its longest and most complicated performance was about to receive an unexpected intermission. The research station buzzed with an unusual energy. Gibek hunched over his terminals, scanning through countless data streams from a small, unremarkable star system. Something was different. Something was strange. For months, his team had been analyzing an odd collection of transmissions from a distant blue planet, Earth, a world so insignificant that most galactic records barely mentioned its existence. But Guy saw something others missed: potential. Yuna Shin entered the research chamber, her hands holding a stack of preliminary reports. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. The holographic displays came alive with human history, short, violent, but incredibly dynamic. Where other civilizations had developed slow, predictable technological progress, humans seemed to leap forward in explosive bursts of innovation. a species that went from stone tools to nuclear technology in mere centuries, a civilization that could transform its entire technological landscape in a single generation. G's fingers moved across the data interface. Human military history showed something unprecedented. They adapted. They changed. They broke rules that other civilizations considered fundamental to warfare and survival. The neutral Galactic Council had been searching for a solution to the endless conflict. Hundreds of species had been studied, analyzed, considered. But humans remained an overlooked footnote in galactic records. Look at their conflict resolution, Una pointed out. Human wars were complex, messy, but they always seemed to end. Unlike the perpetual battle between the Valaran Confederacy and the Krell Imperium, human conflicts had clear beginnings and ends. Their technological development was even more surprising. Humans invented entirely new technologies in response to challenges. Where other species would spend generations perfecting existing systems, humans would simply create something entirely new. Jai discovered something extraordinary in their psychological profiles. Humans possessed an almost chaotic creativity. They didn't just solve problems. They reimagined entire systems of problem-solving. Their military strategies were not just about fighting, but about understanding and transforming conflict. The research team worked through cycles of artificial daylight, piecing together a comprehensive analysis of human potential. Their reports became increasingly exciting. Here was a species that didn't just adapt, they transformed everything they touched. Military simulations revealed something shocking. When humans approached a conflict, they didn't just fight. They analyzed, they understood, they found solutions that completely changed the nature of the conflict itself. One report showed how humans had turned former enemies into allies multiple times in their short history. They possessed a unique ability to see beyond immediate conflicts, to understand deeper motivations and create innovative solutions. Una's hands shook as she compiled the final report. "They might be the key," she whispered. The neutral Galactic Council had been searching for a solution for thousands of years, and here, on a small blue planet, might be the answer. The research station's AI began running complex predictive models. Each simulation that included human involvement showed dramatic and unexpected outcomes. Where other species saw limitations, humans saw opportunities. G looked at the images of human cities, human technologies, human conflicts. They were messy, complicated, sometimes violent, but they were also dynamic, creative, constantly changing. The Neutral Galactic Council would soon receive their report, a recommendation that seemed impossible. A suggestion that a young, relatively primitive species might hold the key to ending an 800,000-year-old conflict. Outside the research station, stars continued their silent watch. Massive battleships from the Valaran Confederacy and Krell Imperium continued their predictable dance of destruction. They had no idea that everything was about to change. A small blue planet, barely a footnote in galactic records, was about to become the most important discovery in thousands of years of conflict. The first human delegation arrived without fanfare. Jin Wu stood at the center of the interstellar conference chamber, his presence both unremarkable and somehow extraordinary. Behind him, a small team of military strategists and diplomats waited, quietly. The Galactic Council representatives watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Humans were an unknown quantity. A species that had barely begun exploring their own solar system now stood before the most complex diplomatic challenge in galactic history. Sora Han stepped forward, her data tablet containing centuries of human conflict resolution strategies. The room fell silent as she began to speak. Her approach was unlike anything the alien diplomats had ever experienced. Direct, adaptive, almost unpredictable. "We understand your conflict," she said simply. The translation system struggled to capture the nuance of her words. It wasn't a statement of sympathy, but a declaration of intent. Jin Wu began presenting analysis that made the veteran diplomats shift uncomfortably. Where previous approaches had been complex and indirect, humans brought a startling simplicity. They broke down the 800,000-year conflict into its most basic components: resource allocation, territorial disputes, cultural misunderstandings. The first simulation shocked everyone. Human strategic models completely redesigned the conflict resolution approach. They didn't just propose a solution, they reimagined the entire concept of the conflict. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for generations suddenly showed movement. The Valaran Confederacy and Krell Imperium found themselves facing an approach they couldn't predict or counter. Humans introduced concepts that were simultaneously simple and revolutionary. Military strategists watched in disbelief as human analysts began breaking down centuries of conflict. They didn't just analyze battle strategies. They examined the entire social, economic, and psychological framework of the war. Jin Wu's team presented alternative resource allocation models that made the current conflict seem absurdly outdated. They showed how the resources spent on war could transform entire civilizations. It wasn't a plea for peace. It was a practical economic argument that was impossible to ignore. Sora Han's diplomatic approach was equally surprising. She didn't negotiate. She reframed the entire conversation. Where previous diplomats had used complex language, humans used clarity that cut through millennia of diplomatic obfuscation. The first practical demonstrations were almost too simple to be believed. Human mediators showed how minor adjustments in communication and resource sharing could resolve conflicts that had seemed impossible to solve. Communication channels between the Valaran Confederacy and Krell Imperium began to change. For the first time in thousands of years, both sides found themselves genuinely listening. The human delegation didn't present themselves as saviors. They were problem solvers, approaching the conflict with a combination of mathematical precision and creative thinking that was entirely new to galactic diplomacy. Technological proposals followed. Humans didn't just suggest solutions. They demonstrated practical implementations. They showed how shared technological development could be more beneficial than continuous warfare. Jin Wu's final presentation was a masterpiece of strategic thinking. He didn't just propose an end to the conflict. He outlined a path to mutual growth that made the previous 800,000 years of war seem like a terrible misunderstanding. The Galactic Council watched in stunned silence. These humans, from a planet most had barely noticed, were fundamentally changing everything they understood about conflict, diplomacy, and interstellar relations. As the first session concluded, something had changed. The cold mathematical certainty that had defined the galactic conflict for centuries began to crack. Humans had introduced something entirely unexpected: hope. Outside the conference chamber, stars continued their silent watch. But something was different. The endless dance of war had encountered an entirely new possibility. The transformation began quietly. Haewon Park stood on the observation deck, watching as former enemy ships moved in coordinated patterns. What had once been battlegrounds were now becoming shared development zones. Sung Kim's diplomatic strategies had done more than end a war. They had rewritten the fundamental understanding of conflict resolution. The 800,000-year war dissolved, not through massive battles but through a series of innovative agreements that made continued conflict seem absurd. Planetary reconstruction became the new priority. Entire star systems that had been reduced to wasteland began showing signs of renewal. Species that had known only war now faced the challenge of building instead of destroying. The human approach was surprisingly simple. They didn't impose a solution. They created frameworks that allowed both the Valaran Confederacy and the Krell Imperium to save face while moving toward mutual development. Economic models replaced military strategies. Shared technological development became more profitable than continuous conflict. Refugee populations from countless destroyed worlds began the process of rebuilding. Humans brought something unexpected. Not just technological solutions, but a profound understanding of recovery and rehabilitation. Resource allocation algorithms developed by human economists showed how the trillions spent on war could transform entire civilizations. What had seemed like an impossible dream became a practical reality. Communication channels that had been silent for thousands of years began to hum with new energy. Cultural exchange programs replaced military intelligence networks. Schools that had trained soldiers now taught diplomacy and collaborative development. HFY's team worked tirelessly, creating frameworks that addressed the root causes of the conflict. They didn't just negotiate peace, they redesigned the entire social and economic structure that had made war seem inevitable. The neutral Galactic Council watched in amazement. Humans had done what centuries of diplomatic efforts had failed to achieve. They had found a way to transform conflict into opportunity. Technological exchanges became the new currency of interstellar relationships. Where once there were weapon systems, now there were joint research facilities. Species that had known only destruction began to understand the potential of collaboration. Sung Kim's most significant achievement was helping both civilizations see beyond their historical hatred. He didn't just broker peace. He helped them reimagine their entire relationship. Planetary ecosystems that had been destroyed began to show signs of recovery. Massive reconstruction efforts transformed wastelands into potential new homes. Species that had lost everything began to find hope. The human approach was neither soft nor aggressive. It was pragmatic. They showed both the Valaran Confederacy and the Krell Imperium that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. Economic models replaced military strategies. Shared technological development became more attractive than continuous warfare. What had seemed like an impossible dream became a practical reality. Old military leaders who had known nothing but war found themselves becoming architects of peace. Training facilities that had produced warriors now trained diplomats and economic developers. The transformation wasn't instant. It was a careful, methodical process that required patience and innovation. Humans brought a unique combination of creativity and practical problem-solving that changed everything. Star systems that had been battlegrounds became joint development zones. Species that had been enemies for thousands of years began to see each other as potential partners. HFY Park watched the first joint diplomatic mission launch. It carried representatives from both previously warring civilizations. The ship's design was a combination of technologies from different species, a living symbol of the new reality. Sung Kim's final report to the Galactic Council was simple and profound. The 800,000-year war had not been stopped. It had been made irrelevant. Humans had shown that conflict was a choice, not an inevitability. As the first joint research vessels launched, something fundamental had changed. The galaxy that had known only destruction was learning to build. Humanity had done more than end a war. They had shown a new way of existing.